in that sense, it's really the case that those surveillance reconnaissance operations are more a reflection of these divergent interests and ideologies than they are fueling the contest.
From Asia News Weekly, you're listening to Asia Now, a collection of stories and interviews from the Asia-Pacific region. China says the East and South China Seas belong to them. ASEAN members and Japan take exception with that territorial claim. Is Asia heading towards a new Cold War? Is just one conversation taking place in Asia? Now. Hello everyone and welcome to this week's Asia Now podcast. I'm your host, Steve Miller, and I'd like to thank you for listening and downloading this week's show. In the Asia-Pacific region, one of the situations I find most troubling is that surrounding the territorial battles regarding the East and South China Seas. Ever since China unveiled its 9-dash line, which it says offers historical evidence that the area is inherently theirs, we've seen a number of high-profile events with neighboring nations. China and Vietnam this summer squared off in the South China Sea when China moved an oil rig into Vietnam's exclusive economic zone. Vietnamese fishing and Coast Guard vessels were either sunk or damaged, and then citizens rioted in the streets, damaging Chinese factories. The United States and Japan have both had their patrol crafts buzzed by Japanese fighters while on patrol. During the United States' recent Valiant Shield 2014 exercise in the region, I spoke with Rand Corporation political analyst Scott Harold by phone and asked him if he thought we were entering a new Cold War in the area, and if he thought we might have to face some crucial event before all parties would step back to ease tensions.
Neither the United States government nor the Chinese government, nor for that matter the Japanese government, talk about wanting a Cold War. The Chinese government will routinely accuse the U.S. Of having or harboring a Cold War mentality and will describe U.S. alliances in the Asia-Pacific as remnants of the Cold War and as reflecting continuation of Cold War thinking. On the U.S. side, I think it's fair to say that there is a substantial degree of concern about China's behavior, but in the form of trying to push U.S. maritime surveillance activities further and further from China's territorial waters and airspace. But I don't think that concern is mimicked or imitated, for example, when it comes to Chinese vessels in areas proximate to U.S. territorial air and maritime spaces. So, for example, the Chinese have had these vessels floating kind of 13 or 14 nautical miles off of the U.S. coastline. That's fine in the U.S. perspective. I mean, it doesn't mean we like it, but our view is we have no legal grounds to complain about it because that's the interpretation that we have of what's allowed in exclusive economic zone areas under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea.
Absolutely. Even Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery said, in the Valiant Shield, there was a Chinese spy vessel outside there, and he's fine with that.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a little bit disingenuous to say fine with it in the sense. Fine with it in the sense of yes, we recognize that they are within their rights to do that.
Correct.
I certainly don't. I don't think sometimes the U.S. government, in its desire to try to use a call for reciprocity, in other words, hey, here's a set of rules we could both play by. We welcome your playing by those rules in our play space, China. Now we hope that by welcoming you to do so in our play space, you will welcome us to do so in what you view as your play space. The Chinese side doesn't view it that way at all, I don't think. And the Chinese side's view is the U.S. has no problem with this, then we will do it in areas where the U.S. has no problem with it. However, we have a different view of EEZ waters and what military activities are allowed in those, and we're going to continue to push back. So I think the U.S. side is largely engaging in rather fatuous exercise in wishful thinking if it believes that by welcoming China to do it 13 nautical miles off our coast, that's going to mean that China is going to welcome us to do it 13 nautical miles off theirs. Unfortunately, that's the case. I just don't think they are. Now, back to the Cold War question, I think, the U.S. side doesn't really view us as necessarily in a long-term conflict with China. I think the Chinese side, however, has long harbored the view that international society is characterized as a struggle for power among nations, that national survival requires the constant agglomeration of more and more national power, and that anyone who thinks that we can all just get along and that the happy times are here because we're no longer in a period of Cold War like we were from 1945 to 1991, is fooling themselves. The real basis for that, I think, is in some ways actually quite accurate. The Chinese view is the U.S. ultimately wants to see the Chinese Communist Party evolve towards liberal democratic rule of law system with multiple contestants for power and political transparency and accountability. While the U.S. is not pushing that actively and has no democracy promotion, no active democracy promotion agenda that seeks to topple the Chinese Communist Party directly. Nonetheless, things like sponsoring civil society, criticizing Chinese human rights violations, judicial training, all of those go to the notion of a U.S. set of aspirational policies that would ultimately lead to the Chinese Communist Party no longer being a one-party Marxist-Leninist dictatorship. And so in that sense, the Cold War that you were describing that could be fueled perhaps just by, operational issues associated with maritime surveillance and reconnaissance operations is actually, I think, fueled more in the Chinese mind by the underlying differential in power as well as the differences in ideology and interests. And so in that sense, it's really the case that those surveillance reconnaissance operations are more a reflection of these divergent interests and ideologies than they are fueling the contest. Now, that's not to say that those kinds of activities cannot have their own kind of independent causal value. I think they can cause the kinds of standoffs to some extent that you talk about. But the reality is the U.S. is doing, hundreds of these every year near China, and we've seen 5 or 6
just
that have really become
a
handful over the last 15 years. We all know what the first one was. The first one was the EP3 incident in 2001. The U.S. impeccable. There's the USS John McCain that got bumped. That wasn't even a reconnaissance operation. That was a Chinese sub was trailing the John McCain and bumped its tow to race sonar. You've got, I don't remember what, the Invincible and the Cowpens incident, and then this latest P-8, which I don't even know if they've given a name to that plane or if it's just a P-8. I don't think we name our planes really, or we don't talk about it that way. So in total, we really don't have a very large number of these instances, but I do think that we could say that, the majority of these incidents that we've seen publicly talked about, the majority of those have come in the last, say, 4 or 5 years. So that may indicate a marginal upticking in tensions associated with these reconnaissance operations, but I think the underlying issues are much greater. The underlying issues of, China's growing assertiveness in foreign policy vis-a-vis Japan, vis-a-vis India, vis-a-vis the Southeast Asian claimant states to parts of the South China Sea. And I think that's where those issues together, maybe with the cyber issue, which has an enormously destabilizing function to it. It really undercuts, as you noted in your earlier comment, the business community's ability to argue for stable relations. If the U.S. business community and the international business community more broadly lose confidence in their ability to use China as a venue, first as a market for their products, and second as a production and assembly site, and decide, the China market's not worth it. We get hacked every time we're there. Our products get copied. Our IPR gets stolen. Our executives get harassed. They have to breathe polluted air. The product safety gets us in trouble with our domestic markets because people find out we use slave labor, or the products are not actually what was advertised, and the toothpaste causes your kids' teeth to fall out and your dog gets poisoned. All of these things coming together can ultimately undercut the business community, which is the kind of ballast, if you will, in the relationship. No matter how bad the strategic picture gets, as long as you have the business community saying, hey, but we can make money with China, and Chinese products provide us an opportunity to give U.S. consumers a greater standard of living, that helps balance the relationship. But as Chinese actions undercut those arguments increasingly, I think then you get a real risk that we get back to that Cold War era where you say, well, we didn't trade with the Soviets. Who cares what the Soviets do in their economy? It doesn't matter. We can only view them through, we can afford to view them exclusively through the lens of the security challenges and the ideological crimes that they are committing against human rights and what they stand for. And if we get to the point with China, which we could easily get to in terms of, the Chinese do pose a security challenge to our interests. They clearly diverge from good global governance standards for human rights and all sorts of other issues domestically. But if we abandon that economic leg, then we're in a really dangerous situation where we don't get a lot of value out of this relationship unless the Chinese start changing their foreign and security behavior, and they wouldn't get a lot out of us. So I think that could lead us into a more Cold War type setting. And unfortunately, over the last several years, we've seen a lot of evidence that Chinese preference for doing everything domestically, hoping to build their own airplanes, hoping to build their own automobile industry, looking to become world leaders in solar, in high-speed rail, in every advanced industry, and actually trying to write legislation inside China that, gives unfair preference to domestic firms. Those indicators really push the relationship in that very untoward, unhealthy, negative direction. So, the risk is not to be underestimated, I fear.
Scott Harold is a political analyst with the Rand Corporation, and I'd like to thank him very much for joining me this week. It was recently reported in the Mainichi newspaper, citing Japanese government sources, that China and Japan might be planning to meet and negotiate a solution to competing claims over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. The sources claim that Prime Minister Shinzo Abe would reassert to President Xi Jinping that during the meeting, the Senkakus are an inherent part of Japanese territory. However, Abe would also then acknowledge that China has a case as well, and then finally propose settling the issue through mutual dialogue over time. If true, it would go a long way to help resolve some of the tension in the area. But for now, there's been no confirmation of any high-level meetings, and that particular line of dialogue is contrary to the stated Japanese position on those rocky islands. But now I'd like to hear from you. What do you see in your crystal ball for the South and East China Seas? Please leave your thoughts in the comments on Facebook or Twitter. If you haven't found us on social media, well, those addresses are quite simple. Just surf on over to facebook.com/Asian News Weekly or find us on Twitter @Asian News Weekly. You can also drop us an email. That address is asiannewsweekly@gmail.com. You can send us your thoughts, your questions, or even your comments about the show. You can also play and download all of our episodes on our website, asiannewsweekly.net. But if you prefer the show in podcast form, please find us on Stitcher, iTunes, and TuneIn Radio. And if you enjoyed this week's episode, please share it with your friends and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. All right, my friends, thank you very much for listening this week. Until next time, for Asia Now, I'm Steve Miller. Asia Now is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License.